The House of Commons of Canada has passed a controversial motion um, known as M-103. I'm not sure what that stands for, but I want to talk a bit about this because I think it's extremely important in terms of freedom of expression and conscience. Um, I'm going to use Al Jazeera as a source. That's just the news report I'm reading out from. So Al Jazeera can hardly be accused of being an alt-right source. Um, Before I get into this, I want to just emphasize I'm not a legal scholar, and if I say anything in this video that's inaccurate, that's not deliberate. It's simply because I'm not an expert on legal terminology. Um, so I'm going to read out this report. It's not too long. Bear with me. Then talk a bit about my concerns about this. Okay, non-binding motion tasks. The Canadian government was studied to develop ways to address racism and discrimination. Canadian politicians have passed a motion that condemns Islamophobia and requests that the government recognise the need to quell the public climate of fear and hate. The non-binding motion, which condemns Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, passed on Thursday among a divided parliament. It asks a parliamentary committee to launch a study on how the government could address the issue, with recommendations due in mid-November. The study should look at how to develop a whole of government approach to reducing or eliminating systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, the motion says. Liberal MP Iqra Khalid introduced the motion, also referred to as M-103, last December, but gained significance after the January attack on a Quebec mosque that left 6 Muslim men dead. I think we need to continue to build those bridges amongst Canadians, and this is just one way we could do this, Khalid said after the vote in Parliament. The motion garnered an online backlash, petitions against it, and nationwide protests. According to local media, Khalid has also received death threats after introducing M103. Critics worried that condemning Islamophobia barred them from criticising Islam, which could curtail the right to free speech. A poll from Angus Reid Institute published on Thursday showed that 42% of respondents would have voted against the measure and only 29% would have approved it. Following the Quebec mosque attack, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government has come under pressure to denounce all forms of religious discrimination. In recent months, several mosques and synagogues have been vandalised in towns across Canada. Um, and the report shows a number of tweets, probably based on the pictures, the screenshot says showing its divided opinions. Now, the situation with blasphemy legislation in Canada, I'm not talking about blasphemy isn't in the modern sense of Sharia law and all that. I'm talking about blasphemy libel in the sense of the common law of England, which goes back to very old 16th century statutes in the Kingdom of England, which were then spread around the British Empire. As it stands, according to Wikipedia, just go read this out briefly. Blasphemous libel was originally an offence under the common law of England. Today it is an offence under the common law of Northern Ireland. It is a statutory offence in Canada and New Zealand, and it has been abolished in England and Wales. It consists of the publication of material which exposes a Christian religion to scurrility, vilification, ridicule, and contempt, and the material must have the tendency to shock and outrage the feelings of Christians. It is a form of criminal libel. As I understand it, the last time this was prosecuted in Canada was 1935. Um, and I'll just briefly check according to the Wikipedia report. Quebec, yeah, I'm not surprised by that. I've always got the impression that Quebec is more religious than other parts of Canada in terms of Christianity. Um, no particular reason for that perception. It's just a perception that I have. Northern Ireland, again, I'm not particularly surprised by that. Northern Ireland tends to be more religious than other parts of the UK. However, the last time that was prosecuted was 1935, and I very much doubt the outcome would have been, flogged, the perpetrator being flogged or jailed. Um, I've mentioned before, when we talk about blasphemy, there are certain statutes in place in Western countries. In my opinion, we need to get rid of all blasphemy legislation, including old Christian blasphemy legislation. But the real issue today is with Islam, because when we look at the world we are living in parts of the world, there are people who literally live in fear because of either the perception of criticizing Islam or that they have been brave enough to do so. Um, I think this motion is deeply problematic. Now, defenders of the motion say it is just a motion, it's not legislation. But this is the beginning of, in my view, very regressive path. Now, what happened in Quebec City? Let me just Google very quickly here the perpetrators of that attack. This is important. Um, Obviously, that event is being used as the context for this motion to be passed by um, yeah, suspected perpetrator Alexandre Bisonnet. So whether he was motivated by hatred of Muslims or, it seems to be an ongoing investigation. I think it's fair to say that was a far right attack, um, neo-nationalist attack, call it what you will. Um, Islamophobic, well, if it's motivated by hatred of Muslims, then I suppose that's a fair enough adjective. I've always had a problem with the adjective though because I feel that too often it's been used to stem legitimate criticism of Islam. Um, I think the problem with this motion is that there is this exceptionalism with Islamophobia. In theory, it's supposed to be condemning all racism and systematic racism and religious discrimination. So why does Islam kind of get VIP protection under this law? I mean, I would be interested if this Liberal MP, firstly, I condemn death threats against her. I think that's stupid and that can never be condoned. But she must have known this was going to be controversial. Um, and the simple question I would ask is why give Islam kind of special protection over other religions? Surely, if you're going to introduce something that's meant to be unifying civic society, then it should be across the board. I think that's what's angered a lot of people. The other thing is, in my experience, from what I've seen from Canadian liberals and the Canadian left, they're even more consumed by the cult of political correctness than their American and European counterparts. I mean, they seem to be absolutely. I think it's a major issue in Canada, and it's been very obvious since Justin Trudeau came into office. Um, and it's something I find deeply frustrating that people feel that if you question Islamic fascism, Islamism, that somehow means that you hate all Muslims. Ever since the London attack, we've been hearing this line from people making ridiculous equivalencies. One thing that I've seen, and this is relevant, I think, to the video, one thing that I've seen is, oh, the IRA done terrible things, but we never, accused all Catholics of, we never targeted all Catholics. Well, the IRA analogy is stupid. The IRA certainly were guilty of some appalling atrocities. They had a lot of blood on their hand, but they were never religious psychos. They were never motivated by religion. They never carried out attacks, whether it be in London or Belfast or Birmingham, and said, we're doing this for the Roman Catholic Church. That was never ever their motivation. Their motivation was territorial nationalism, and their belief in getting a united Ireland through violence. Um, that was the motivation. It was never religious. So, being from Northern Ireland, I feel frustrated when I see people make that analogy because it demonstrates their ignorance about pan Islamism. Pan Islamism is motivated by theocracy. That is the guiding philosophy of pan Islamism. So it's a phony analogy. Um, Secondly, it is important to recognize not all Muslims are the same, and there are some people who genuinely hate all Muslims. But I think that when we see Islamist attacks, there are too many people who immediately rush into that school of thought, oh, not all Muslims, not all Muslims. The truth is, any intelligent person knows it is not all Muslims. But frankly, I mean, there was a rally, I can't remember if it was London or Birmingham, but there was a rally organized by a Muslim group to say, not in our name. Now, the left kind of took that to be, oh, look, these are good Muslims kind of standing up against terrorism. I read that as them just trying to deny the obvious. And I read that not as them being particularly bothered about the attack, but being more concerned about the image to their faith. If you're more concerned about Islam getting a bad image than you are about the bloody acts of violence and intolerance that are done in the name of pan Islamism, I would suggest you have your priorities wrong. And what I find insufferable is the regressive left really are pushing to silence people. So this may only be emotion, but you know, this could very well turn into law. And given the nature of Justin Trudeau's government, you know, this guy is virtue signaler in chief. Um, and to me, him and his party sum up everything that is wrong with the regressive left because they pretend to be all about equality and all about tolerance and, you know, all these nice, rosy buzzwords. But if you are not outspoken against Islamist fascism and if you don't call it for what it is, then as far as I'm concerned, you're phony when you talk about tolerance. You're phony when you talk about liberal values. I'm talking about liberal values in the sense of classical liberalism, in the sense of genuine liberty, not in the sense of we better not say that in case it offends somebody. And I find, frankly, this cowardly surrendering to political correctness to be utterly insufferable. Now, to be clear here, what happened in Quebec City in the mosque attack, that was a terrorist attack. It was an outrage. It should be condemned. And I have no problem with legislation that prosecutes hate crime. For example, if a Muslim person is minding their own business and they're attacked simply for being a Muslim, the perpetrator should be punished, of course. But I think there's an enormous amount of naivety going on. And to me, this is just the latest example. Now, I don't condemn death threats, but I don't have a great deal of sympathy with this MP because it seems to me she is pushing to have privilege for Islam. Um, and it seems to me she's using, you know, we always say, well, the far right uses Islamist terrorism to divide people. Well, surely this is an example of the regressive left using anti Muslim attack to push for regressive legislation. What's the difference? So, you know, if certain neo Nazis or neo nationalists use an Islamist attack to say it's okay to hate all Muslims, that's regressive thinking. But how is that any different from a liberal, presumably Muslim MP saying, you know, we need special legislation to protect Muslims? I think that's a really dangerous move. Unless I'm mistaken, Canada already has hate crime legislation. So I don't really see why further legislation is needed. And another thing about this is the government of Canada and the Canadian left are sending out this message this is what Canada is all about. Based on comments I've seen, a lot of Canadians are not happy about this. I don't actually believe that all Canadians are kind of naive, ultra liberal, ultra regressive left people. I think there are a lot of Canadians who are very well aware of what is going on because it is the same things that is going on across the Western world, across the world from that perspective. I mean, this is a worldwide problem. The reason I'm focusing on Western countries is we are supposed to be upholding liberal values. We're supposed to be upholding democratic liberal values, and yet we're surrendering it to gutless political correctness. I have no problem with the perpetrator of the Quebec City mosque attack being dealt with the full force of the law. And I've no problem with it being called a terrorist attack. And here's the thing sometimes I've seen Muslims say, oh, should white people apologize for white neo Nazis? Here's my take I would never expect a Muslim to apologize for Islamic extremism, but I do expect them to acknowledge it. Now, as a white guy, I acknowledge that there are white neo Nazis out there. I can't say, for example, I'm a white heterosexual man, right? I cannot claim that there are not bad white heterosexual men out there who maybe hate Muslims, who hate people of other races, who abuse women, whatever. I believe every community has a responsibility to be honest about the black sheep in their midst. And to me, this is just the latest example. I mean, it's not the first time. The Blair government in Britain tried pushing similar legislation, which again was deeply controversial because it was viewed as censoring legitimate criticism of faith. Religion does not deserve special protection. It shouldn't, in my opinion. There's a big difference between hating Muslims and, frankly, hating religion. I believe it is okay to hate Islam. The problem, of course, lies in when people then start justifying hatred of Muslim people. That's different. But I think it is completely valid to hate certain Islamic views. I, for example, hate the way that ex Muslims are treated and the attitude towards apostasy. These are very important questions. And this, I'm not sure, incidentally, what M-103 stands for. Maybe someone can enlighten me on that. I'm just going to read a few tweets here that Al Jazeera has highlighted. Andrew Law, Canada's parliament has just declared criticism of Islam off limits. The anti-Islamophobia motion M103 passed by a margin of 201 to 91. So that's quite a sizable majority in parliament. Angry Auntie says Canada passes what are in actuality blasphemy laws to protect a ridiculous ideology from ridicule. It's 2017, not 1517. Nikki Ashton writes, proud to have voted for M103 against Islamophobia. We must work with Muslim CD and I suppose that means councillors or community leaders to achieve racial and economic justice through action. Weakest link goodbye. M103 is a motion, not a bill. It calls on the government to more diligently gather hate speech into the wake of, that mosque being shot up. Um, what I see from a lot of comments online is profound naivety. People say things like, like I said, not all Muslims are the same. Here's the thing, anyone with a brain can see that. But I really don't think there are that many people who hate all Muslims. And frankly, Muslims are far, far safer in Western countries than non Muslims are in Islamic majority countries. That's a fact. If you doubt me, look at a country like Pakistan, where there have been many ugly examples of mobs literally killing people because they've been accused of blasphemy, sometimes based on a rumor. In Egypt, not long ago, a Christian grandmother was forced to strip naked and surrounded by a Muslim mob. There is no rational comparison between the situation of Muslims in the West and the situation of non Muslims, or for that matter, minority Muslim sects such as Sufis, Ahmadis, in Islamic majority countries. So I don't really buy into the Muslim victimhood narrative. I'm not saying that there aren't individual incidents happen, hate crime incidents. I'm not downplaying that. It's horrible. No one should be violently attacked because of the faith. That's wrong. But I do think there has to be honesty here. And this may only be emotion, but I would not put it past the Trudeau government to turn this into law. Because this is the same prime minister who not long ago said we should be culturally sensitive or something to that effect in relation to honor killings. Yeah, he said we shouldn't call honor killings barbaric. He was forced to apologize, such was the outcry. I think Justin Trudeau is not a great liberal figure of justice and morality. I think he's in some ways he is a very bad example of the regressive left. I think it's because he's charismatic, he's got good looks, he's kind of, he fits into that mold of the suave, sophisticated world leader. But when you start to look at some of Trudeau's policies, really raises question marks as far as I'm concerned. Um, I see nothing honourable whatsoever in being apathetic to human rights abuses carried out by backward religious ideology. So, yeah, if you're Canadian, let me know your thoughts on this. If you support it, um, I want to know, do you believe there should be freedom for people to criticize Islam? And I don't want to hear any sort of vague statements like, oh, I believe in freedom of speech and people can criticize religion. We're talking about Islam here. Let's be specific. Because this, I mean, this is, I think, why the motion is so problematic, because it is presented as making Islam stand out, as giving Islam special protection. That for me is very problematic. And I think she's using the mosque attack as a reason for doing that. Let me know your thoughts.